So, do you think that he went into wrestling to become more menacing?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I mean, he had a friendship with a guy called Bill Benny, who was a sort of famous wrestler in the 50s. Huge, sort of hulking guy who was a big figure in the sort of Manchester clubland at that time. Was also a professional wrestler. I think that the first time was probably you know a publicity stunt that he was to go in the ring as a publicity stunt, but I think it definitely gilded that image as a guy who was physically strong, who could look after himself, who was not to be messed with. Yeah, and I think that even though his record was pretty awful, and he did get beaten an awful lot, I don't think it did any harm to that persona that he was trying to cultivate.
How did he get discovered by Radio Luxembourg?
He got discovered by Radio Luxembourg because his dance halls were doing so well. He'd become this huge star within Mecca. Mecca ran dance halls all across the country, and Jimmy Savile was their shining light. He was the guy who'd who'd pioneered these record dances. Effectively what we now know as DJs. He had to go up against the musicians union in the early days to play records in between stints by live bands, but his star had risen within Mecca, and I think that he was seen as somebody who attracted a crowd of teenagers. And at a time when rock and roll music was sort of erupting across the landscape, who better than the guy playing these records in his dance halls to adoring teenage fans, to go to front a show called the Teen and 20 Disc Club, which was the big show that sort of broke him on Radio Luxembourg and then led into the BBC.
So, was his claim that he was the first to do this accurate, being a disc jockey on the turntables?
I think there'll be others who would definitely counter that, but I think he has a definite claim to be the person who popularized this form of dancing to recorded music rather than, and also he was one of the first high profile dance hall figures to be using two twin turntables, from cutting from one to the other. So he definitely has a place in that history of DJs. Whether he was the first or not is very difficult to say.
So he was definitely a pioneer. When did he start to commit charitable acts, and what do you think really motivated him?
Well, I think he would argue that his charitable acts began early on in life, led by the example of his parents, who, as I said, were active in the local church and in the local community. Um, I think that really it started to, there were small scale fundraisers at his dance halls, but it really started to gather momentum with the I'm Backing Britain campaign, which was under Harold Wilson. And I think he was able to sort of codify his involvement with Leeds General Infirmary and, make that a public part of the I'm Backing Britain campaign. And then we start to see his emergence as somebody who's not just a DJ, not just a dancehall impresario and a radio disc jockey, but somebody who's seen beyond those confines as, working for charity, giving his time. And as we know, the places where he gave his time also afforded him the opportunities to offend.
How did he establish such a close relationship with Leeds police?
Well, that goes back to the dancehall days. He claimed in his book. I mean, this is really interesting that he claimed in his book that the police once came round to his flat, and we're definitely talking in the 60s, but his connection with the police in Leeds goes back well before that, to talk to him about a runaway girl that he claims in his book that he did, give shelter to in his house for a long time, and was berated by the police for, sheltering this girl, and basically sent this female police officer away with a flea in her ear saying, if you take me down, I'll take the rest of the police station, rest of your police station down with you. Um, he he had close relationships with the police in Manchester. I think that in those days, you know, things were probably quite lively on the streets at times. As a prominent local dancehall manager, if there were fights or if there were, the police would have probably been in and out of his premises. So he cultivated them from very early on. And what's really interesting is that he was very overt about, even he talked to me about, the police, coming in and asking him about, why have you got all these underage girls in your dance hall? And his reply, which was typical, was, would you rather your daughter was in this dance hall with me or out there with all those scumbags and slags, in his own words? So, he had this way of almost putting his guilt right under the noses of the local police, whether it be in Manchester, whether it be in Leeds, whether it be in North Yorkshire, and this goes right the way through to him being interviewed by Surrey Police in 2008 under caution at Stoke Mandeville at the end of a 2-year investigation by Surrey Police. He completely dictated where that interview took place. And after they first approached him or contacted him to tell him they wanted to interview him under caution, it was some months before he got back to them. And it wasn't him who got back to them. It was an inspector at West Yorkshire Police who got back to the Surrey Police on Jimmy Savile's behalf and, mentioned that he gets all these sorts of letters. Again, it's almost like the words were, the words came out of Savile's mouth and were articulated by this West Yorkshire Police inspector when talking to the Surrey Police about arranging an interview under caution at the end of a 2-year investigation. And that interview ended up taking place at Stoke Mandeville. So he dictated the terms of that interview, he dictated the timing of that interview, and he dictated the venue of that interview.
Yeah, one of the most surprising and shocking stories of his interactions with the police, I think it was in your book actually, was whereby a policeman approached his vehicle. He was in his Rolls with a young-looking female, and he said, "What you doing, Jimmy?" And he said, "Waiting until midnight for when she turns 16." And then basically tells him to F off or he's going to have his job pulled. Paraphrasing, but is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly accurate, yeah. He was in a lay-by near Roundhay Golf Club, and he said it was 11:45 at night, and he said, "I'm waiting for midnight for her to turn 16. I mean, this was sort of, he put it out there all the time. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, he put it out there in his newspaper columns. He put it out there in his books. He put it out there in the interviews he did with me and others. And it was a high wire act that he had correctly, as it turns out, calculated would ensure that he wasn't caught. It was almost like, if you think from his point of view, he's sort of putting it all out there. Why would he? I'm sure that his defense would be, why on earth would I be saying all this stuff if I was guilty? Why would I be leaving this breadcrumb trail of clues if I was guilty? And it was all in plain sight, and it was all. And he wrote about stuff in his newspaper columns. He wrote about picking up girls on the seafront at Scarborough. He talked about, doing an event for charity in Otley in Yorkshire, whereby he insisted, that he was going to camp overnight on a local hillside. And his only condition was that a group of young girls would accompany him as his bodyguards. And he wrote about this in his book. And then I interviewed I tracked down one of the women, who was a teenager at that time, who was in one of those tents. And her account of that evening differs markedly from what Jimmy Savile wrote in his autobiography and in his newspaper columns and so on and so forth. I think that he felt if he could get his side out of the story and get it out in print, then if he could get it out first, then it would be a big insurance policy for him.
So my dad played a bit part in The Reckoning, and before it was broadcast, he said that one of the most disturbing scenes he watched was in Scarborough when Savile and Jack and Ellie, the parents, hand over the girl, and the arms around the girl, and they got the parents' permission to walk away. How did he establish this relationship with Jack and Ellie, and were they co-conspirators in crimes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of smoke around Peter Giaconelli's name. I mean, they were two very prominent people in Scarborough. He was the local ice cream magnate, who sort of ran the seafront, along with James Corrigan, who ran the fairground and the amusements. But Giaconelli was a big figure. He was a mayor, former mayor of Scarborough. So, Savile gravitated towards people in power and people in influence. I mean, obviously Giaconelli would have been a bit part player for him, but in one of the many locales that he bounced between, and Savile did live this nomadic lifestyle. He never stayed anywhere for long, which I think is another reason that he evaded sort of exposure and capture for so long. And Giaconelli was one of the sort of coterie, or the groups of acolytes in Scarborough. There is definitely a very, very strong suggestion that they were part of a paedophile ring in North Yorkshire. Yeah.